Well, good afternoon, brethren. Happy Sabbath to you and happy Sabbath to everyone who's joining us near and far on the webcast on this steamy Brisbane day today. Now, today I'm going to put my Israel tour guide hat back on and take you to another beautiful part of the Holy Land that's rich in Bible history, the Sorek Valley. It seems appropriate that we're going to have an All Israel Day today, considering the sad events that we've had this particular week. Now, today we're going to explore the geography of this valley, look at 3 Bible stories that took place there, and draw a practical lesson that we can learn from each of these events. Now, the Sorek Valley is part of southern Israel in a region known as the Shephelah. Now, the Shephelah is a Hebrew word that means the Judean lowlands or foothills. Now, it's a beautiful region of green rolling hills and valleys, around 10 to 15 kilometres wide, that lies between the coastal plain, where the Philistines were based, and the Judean highlands. Now, the Sorek Valley lies between the Ayalon Valley, where the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem goes through, and the Elah Valley, best known for the famous battle between David and Goliath. Now, here's a satellite map showing the key locations in the valley. Now, the valley was guarded by Beth Shemesh, shown here in red, and the other locations shown in blue, Timnah, Zorah, Eshtaol, and Lehi, all relate to the story of the mighty Samson. Now, the Sorek stream formed the tribal boundary between the tribes of Dan in the north and Judah in the south. In Dan, on the northern side of the valley, were the towns of Timnah, Zorah, and Eshtaol, while Beth Shemesh was in Judah on the southern side of the valley. Now, if you look at a map showing the West Bank territory today, formed by the high plateaus of the Sumerian and Judean highlands, you'll notice that it narrows dramatically near Jerusalem. Now, that large green area west of Jerusalem that really stands out on the satellite map on the right-hand side shows the upper Sorek Valley, which acts as a moat around Jerusalem's western side with its very deep valleys and gorges. Now, I'm going to show you now just a quick drone video that I took when our tour group was there a couple of years ago to give you a feel of the valley. Now, today we're going to briefly look at 3 stories that occurred in this valley. Now, 2 of them you'll be likely very familiar with, but probably not the last one. I mean, I wasn't even familiar with the last story until after our last trip there. Now, the first story is the return of the ark from the Philistines to Beth Shemesh. Now, according to Joshua 21, Beth Shemesh was one of the designated cities for the Levites. And specifically, it was the Levitical clan of Kohath who had the responsibility for caring for the ark. So this is the likely reason that God chose this place for the return of the ark from the Philistines. Now, after all the plagues they had, the Philistines finally decided it was time to send it back to Israel. Now, they placed the ark in some trespass offerings on a cart with 2 cows. Now, the previously unyoked cows would not normally work together or go straight. However, since God was guiding events, he saw to it that the cows took it straight up to Beth Shemesh. Now, the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping the wheat harvest when the ark was returned, so this puts the time of its return around June in the early summer. Now, the people harvesting the wheat rejoiced as they saw the ark returning to them. The cows stopped at the field of a man named Joshua. Now, it wasn't a happy ending for the cows as they were offered up by the Levites as a burnt offering to God. Now, the Levites took down the ark and put it on a large stone that was in Joshua's field. Now, if they had properly understood the instructions dealing with the movement and handling of the ark, the tragedy that happened next would not have occurred. Now, a whole lot of men of Beth Shemesh were struck dead by God when they looked at or possibly into the ark, depending on how you read the Hebrew. Now, the rest of the town were terrified and, like the Philistines before them, sought to send it elsewhere. Now, it ends up going up to Kirjath-jearim, further north along the road that went up to Jerusalem. Now, Kirjath-jearim wasn't a Levitical town, but it did have a priest who showed much better care for it than the Levites at Beth Shemesh. Now, the number of people that are quoted here as being killed is quoted as 50,070 men. Now, a great many die from looking at the ark. Now, Adam Clark says the following about the number of men killed. He writes, "From the manner in which the text stands and from the great improbability of the thing, it is most likely that there is a corruption in this text, or that the number 50,000 has been added by ignorance or design. It being very improbable that such a small village as Beth Shemesh should contain or be capable of employing 50,070 men in the fields at wheat harvest." Now, Josephus renders it thus: "But the displeasure and wrath of God pursued them so that 70 men of the village of Beth Shemesh, approaching the ark, which they were not worthy to touch, not being priests, were struck with lightning." So here we find the whole 50,000 is omitted. Now, I kind of wonder if the scene of the men being struck at Beth Shemesh looked a lot like this scene that we see at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, the Levites of Beth Shemesh failed in probably 4 ways to follow God's instructions for caring for the ark. Now, they sacrificed those poor cows the Philistines hooked up to pull the cart with the ark on. Now, on the rare occasions where a female cow was sacrificed, like with the red heifer mentioned in Leviticus 19, it was to be one that had not been previously yoked, as these cows had just been to bring the ark back. Now, all other sacrifices had to be male bulls without blemish. Now, the second thing was that the Levites failed to cover the ark with the blue covering made for it when it wasn't in the tabernacle that's spoken of in Numbers 4. Now, in Numbers 4:20, we're told that the Levites shall not go in to watch while the holy things are being covered by the priests, lest they die. Now, some of those who looked at the ark were probably likely Levites who are not priests of Aaron's family. Now, Numbers 1:51 tells us that the Levites were also responsible for setting up the tabernacle to house the ark and the holy things. Now, they were to keep others away who were not Levites, and any who did come close to it were put to death, it's supposed to be. Now, the ironic thing about what happened here at Beth Shemesh is that a few decades later, when David first attempted to bring the ark up to Jerusalem, he was just as careless with God's instructions, putting the ark on a cart rather than having the ark carried on poles by the Levites. And then Uzzah touched the ark as it was falling off the cart, which cost him his life. Now, David was much more careful the second time when he succeeded in bringing the ark up to Jerusalem. Now, this brings us to our first lesson that we can learn from this first story that happened in the Valley of Sorek. When God gives clear instructions, follow all of them faithfully. We're not to be careless when it comes to what God has specifically commanded in his law and do our own thing, or mix doing some of God's things with doing our own thing. Now, we're currently in the Christmas season. Now, mainstream Christianity attempts to honour God with such festivals, but they have ignored the festivals that he has commanded and replaces them with festivals that he never gave us. Now, even if Christmas had no pagan connections, it would still be wrong because it is a deviation from how God has specifically told us to worship him. Now, the next story we're going to look at is the pattern or theme of the life of Samson, who was from the town of Zorah on the ridge on the northern side of the valley. Now, the story of Samson's life is told to us in 4 chapters of the Bible, from Judges 13, through to Judges 16. Now, I'm just going to give the briefest of summaries of his life before we look at one vital lesson that we can learn from Samson's life. Now, just before Samson was born, his parents were told that he was to be used by God to help deliver Israel from the Israelites, and that he was under a Nazirite vow with 3 conditions: no alcohol, no touching a dead body, or cutting his hair. Now, as he grows up, he first discovers that he has a spiritual gift of supernatural power between Zorah, where he's from, and Eshtaol. Now, we actually read of this same location in a later chapter, Judges 18, as a location where a group of Danites left for the north of Israel, where they conquered a Canaanite city up near Mount Hermon, which later became the city of Dan. Now, Samson ignores the command to marry only an Israelite and loves going after beautiful Philistine women. Now, he selfishly demands his parents arrange a marriage with a girl from Timnah, which was a town in the same valley west of Zorah. Now, on our trip there, he is attacked by a lion and rips it apart. Now, the next time he passes there, honey is found inside the carcass, which he partakes of, and likely touches the dead body in the process. Now, he then organises a drinking feast for the men of Timnah, where he may well have partaken of the wine there as he poses a riddle to them. Now, the Philistines threaten his wife to help him get the answer. Now, when she finds out and tells them the answer, Samson, in his anger, goes down to Ashkelon and kills 30 random Philistines for their clothes to pay off the debt, and then rather go back to his wife, goes back to his family. Now, when he then goes back to his wife later on, he finds out that her father has given her to another man after thinking that he had abandoned her. Now, Samson's anger is again aroused, and he burns the Philistines' fields using foxes that have torches attached to their tails. Now, the men of Judah confront Samson over what he has done and the possibility of retribution from the Philistines on Israel. Now, Samson agrees to be bound and handed over to the Philistines. Now, when the Philistines approach him at Lehi, he breaks his bonds and kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Now, Samson's story then jumps forward in time 20 years, when you think he'd become a little bit more mature. Now, unfortunately, we find him having a night with a Philistine prostitute in Gaza. Now, he gets away from the Philistines lying in wait by ripping off the city gate and carrying it all the way up from the coast to Hebron, some 60 kilometres to the east. Now, Gaza is on the coast, while Hebron is 1,000 metres above sea level. Now, Samson then falls for yet another Philistine woman who also lives nearby in the same valley as Samson, and her name is Delilah. Now, he probably took one look at Delilah and said, my Delilah. Then the Philistine lords offered her a big bag of cash to find out what the secret of his strength was, and she betrays Samson in a heartbeat. Now, with the last of the conditions of his Nazirite vow broken, when his hair is cut, he loses his strength and is taken away by the Philistines. Now, as he's being taken away, no doubt he probably would have turned to Delilah and said, why, Delilah? Now, he's then taken down to Gaza, where they put his eyes out, and he's forced to grind grain. Now, his hair gradually grows back, and he prays for strength one more time, where he brings down a temple of Dagon, crashing down on himself and a few thousand Philistines. Now, Samson was physically the strongest man in the world, yet the story of his life is one full of foolish mistakes. He was a man who could have accomplished so much more good if he was just as mighty spiritually. Now, this brings us to our second lesson. Now, the main lesson that we can learn from Samson's life is to follow the lead of the Holy Spirit. Don't ignore it or resist God's way like Samson did, who for most of the time followed the lusts of his flesh and did things his own way. Now, his selfish approach to life, where he just acted on his feelings, created a big mess in his personal life, which got even bigger after he allowed himself to be betrayed by Delilah. Now, the next story you may not be very familiar with involves a lesser-known king of Judah by the name of Amaziah, who ruled halfway between the good kings of Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah. Now, the king of the northern kingdom at the time was Jehoash, or Joash. Now, Amaziah started off well doing what was right in God's eyes. Now, before going to battle with the Edomites, he hired 10,000 men from the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, Amaziah even obeyed God's word when a prophet told him not to use those guys as mercenaries because of the idolatry of the northern kingdom. Now, after his great victory against Edom, Amaziah became puffed up and stubbornly did things his own way. He foolishly took the idols of the Edomites and began to worship them, would you believe? And a prophet asked him, "Why have you sought the gods of the people who could not rescue their own people from your hand?" Now, Amaziah stubbornly refused to listen. Now, Proverbs 16:18 says that pride becomes before a fall, which is exactly what happened next at Beth-Shemesh. Now, Amaziah became arrogant after defeating the Edomites and picked a fight with the northern kingdom. Now, those mercenaries from the northern kingdom did a lot of damage on their way home, so that is the likely reason Amaziah gave for wanting to fight Israel. Now, Joash told Amaziah, "Indeed, you say you have defeated the Edomites and your heart is lifted up to boast. Stay at home now. Why should you meddle with trouble that you should fall, you and Judah with you?" Now, Amaziah stubbornly refused to listen. He not only lost this battle at Beth-Shemesh, but the king of the northern kingdom conquered Jerusalem, broke down 200 metres of its wall and took everything that he could from the temple and the king's palace. Now, this awful tragedy that happened to Judah made him deeply unpopular and probably played a part in a later coup where he was killed after fleeing to Lachish. Now, this brings us to our third lesson from our third story from the Valley of Sorek. Always stay humble and don't let victories or prosperity tempt you to become arrogant and selfish, as happened to Amaziah. Now, later Beth-Shemesh was conquered by the Philistines in the time of Ahaz to bring Judah low. Now, after that, it was conquered by the Assyrians in Hezekiah's time and by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Now, I mentioned before that the Valley of Sorek was due west of Jerusalem. Now, that means that it probably will play a part in a particular millennial prophecy over in Zechariah 14. Now, in Zechariah 14:8, we read the following: "And in that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them towards the eastern sea, and half of them towards the western sea. Both summer and winter it shall occur." Now, in addition to the Mount of Olives splitting in two, a powerful spring will feed a new river that will be a broad perennial river that branches both east and west, with the western branch of the river flowing into the Mediterranean Sea and the eastern branch into the Dead Sea. Now, on the map on the left here, I've highlighted the current course of the Sorek stream and the Kidron Valley. Now, the western branch of this broad new river will likely join up with the Sorek stream and flow through the Sorek Valley. Now, Zechariah 14:10 speaks of the land of the whole Judean highlands being levelled as a plain, with Jerusalem being raised up higher. Isaiah 11:15 talks of the Gulf of Suez disappearing. Now, the levelling of the Judean highlands and closing of the Gulf of Suez might be caused by a clockwise rotation of the Sinai Peninsula's tectonic subplate. Now, Isaiah 35 verse 6 hints at the possibility that when the Gulf of Suez will be closed up, that the Gulf of Aqaba will be widened. Now, it talks about waters bursting forth, meaning ripped open with great force, and streams opening up in the desert. Now, the Hebrew word for desert here is not the usual word midbar, but Arabah, which means the valley that runs between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea. Now, if the land of the Arabah were to sink below sea level, then the waters of the Red Sea would flow northward towards the Dead Sea, flooding the entire Jordan River Valley up to sea level, right up to the Sea of Galilee, which itself is 200 metres below sea level. Now, even most of the Harod Valley near Bethshan is also below sea level. Now, while the initial burst of water would be seawater, the Jordan River and the new river flowing from Jerusalem would flush out most of the salt water out of the Dead Sea, making it much more fresh over time. Now, in place of the Suez Canal in the millennium, there will likely be a new water superhighway up the Arabah Valley to today's Dead Sea and across Israel by the new East-West River from Jerusalem that flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, courtesy of Jeff and AI, here's a glimpse of what the Sorek Valley might look like in the millennium. And we may well see river cruises and large commercial ships flying up and down the Sorek River Valley in the future. So on that note, let's conclude by summarising the practical lessons from this study of events that occurred in the Sorek Valley. 1, when God gives clear instructions, follow all of them faithfully. 2, follow the lead of the Holy Spirit and don't ignore it or resist it. And 3, always stay humble and don't let victories or prosperity tempt you to become arrogant or selfish. So that concludes our look at the geography and the Bible history of the Valley of Sorek. Thank you.